How's it going, everyone? This is Nick from ReVenture Consulting, and I'm excited to bring you yet another market deep dive where ReVenture Consulting, we use data. We use deep data to cover different cities across the U.S. in terms of their real estate and housing market, helping you as a home buyer or investor figure out where and when is the right time to buy. And I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to do Portland, Oregon. And this is a super interesting real estate market right now. It's actually one that you guys have been asking about. You've been asking for this video for a while. And you're also probably, even if you're not in Portland, you're probably reading about Portland a lot in the headlines recently. I think it's no secret that Portland as a city has been dealing with actually a lot of social and political unrest over the last year. And that's actually really spilling over into the housing market, which is actually kind of crazy. We're already seeing big differences in price appreciation in Portland, depending on the neighborhood you're in, heavily related to where the social unrest is occurring. We're going to get into that data later in the video, but before that, we're also going to talk about Portland at a more macro level, right? How much are jobs and population growing in Portland? How much are real estate prices growing in Portland? And do we think that prices now are at a fair point, or are they overvalued, and is Portland in a bubble? This is really a key question to understand at a more macro level. And then we're going to drill into the more micro. We're going to ask which neighborhoods in Portland represent the best buys, the best value right now. If you're a home buyer already in Portland, or if you're someone looking to move to Portland, you're definitely going to want to watch this video because we're going to give you all the detail and all the data you need to really fundamentally understand everything that's going on in the Portland real estate market. So without further ado, let's get into it. So when I'm talking about Portland in this video, I'm often referring to the Portland metro area. And so that includes the city of Portland, but it also includes outlying suburbs and rural areas. So we're actually covering quite a large geographic footprint. And you can see what I'm talking about here on this map, where we have all of the Portland metro area laid out. And you can see that we're actually looking at 7 different counties which comprise this metro area. And as I said, Multnomah County here in the center, this is the one that really covers most of densely populated Portland. It has a population of about 833,000. Right? And when people talk about Portland, especially the social unrest that's been occurring in the city, they're really talking about this county and more specifically zooming into downtown Portland. But we'll get to that later. If we zoom out, we can see here Clark County to the north. This is actually in the state of Washington, has a population of 500,000. This is a really rapidly growing area. Then we have Washington County to the west. We have cities like Hillsboro and Beaverton. That has a population of 600,000. Then we have Clackamas County to the southeast. These are really the 4 big ones: Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, and Clark. These are really the ones that comprise most of what's going on in the Portland metro area, and those are the ones we're going to be focusing on the most. And the thing to know about Portland more generally is it is an expensive real estate market. Like many other cities in the Pacific Northwest, there's just simply not a lot of land. There's a lot of geographic supply constraints, and as a result, they're not able typically to build enough new housing to support the growth in the city. So you see real estate prices that are really high relative to the rest of the country. The typical price of a home in Portland is $483,000 across the metro, that's just like the standard price across the entire metro area. And that's very, very high. It's actually in the top 15 for metro areas in the United States. And it's also about $200,000 higher than the US average. So when you think Portland, think pretty expensive. And you can see Portland's price history on this graph, and you can see that the Portland metro area, the blue line, wasn't always this expensive compared to the U.S. average, which is the gray line. If we go back to, say, the mid to late 90s, Portland's typical home price was $160,000. The U.S. was $110,000. So back then, Portland was only about a $50,000 higher premium to the rest of the U.S. And this premium pretty much stayed the same all the way through the early 2010s. Right? We see in 2012, Portland's price was $228,000. The U.S. price was $163,000. So again, it was like a $50,000 to $60,000 delta. But really, it's been over the last 7 years where you've seen Portland's price here just skyrocket, well above the US average, all the way up to 483,000, while the US is only at 281. So this widening gap, there's just a widening gap between Portland and the rest of the US in terms of real estate cost. Now, one thing you might notice on this graph is that Portland actually has a bit of a volatile price history. Portland actually got hit really hard by the last housing crash. So if you guys are enjoying the data presented in this video, all I ask is just please hit that like button. I spent a lot of time putting this data together for you guys for free so you can better understand real estate across the country. So again, just please hit that like button. That's all I ask. Additionally, please comment on the video. I want to hear what you guys think. What are your experiences in the real estate market? Particularly if you live in Portland, I want to hear what you're seeing. Do you agree? Do you disagree with me? When you guys comment, it makes me more informed and it makes these videos better. Additionally, make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that already. All right, let's get back to the video. Prices peaked around 320,000 in 2007, and they crashed all the way to 228,000 in 2012, about a 30% decline. So Portland did get hit pretty hard by the last housing crash, and the question on everyone's mind right now is, looking at how high prices are going today, could there be another crash in Portland's future? And the answer to that question is going to really depend on two things. The first is the wages in the local economy, like how much are people in Portland earning relative to how much home prices cost. The second thing it's going to depend on is continued population growth and migration into Portland. So let's address those one by one. The first is wages. And while Portland is a fairly high wage city compared to other ones in the US, its wages are actually not very high relative to the home prices. Portland home prices are actually 8.5 times higher than the average annual earnings of the typical worker. So again, home prices in Portland 8.5 times higher than the average earnings of the typical worker. And that's one of the highest ratios in America. The average city in America is about 4.5 times higher prices than the average earnings of a typical worker. So Portland is really starting to stress the local earnings and wages of the population. And that's a concerning thing for the stability of the housing market, because the same exact situation occurred before the last housing crash. Right before the last housing crash, Portland's price to wage ratio was right around the same level, and it came crashing down. So taking a look at this graph, we're looking at the value to earnings ratio over time in Portland. So what this does is it takes the typical home price as reported by Zillow, and it divides it by the annual earnings of the average worker in Portland. And what we can see here is that prior to the last housing crash in 2007, value to earnings peaked at 8.6. So the typical price back then was 322,000. The typical annual earnings was 38. And that was an 8.6x difference. But then, of course, prices crashed. And when prices crashed, the value to earnings crashed all the way down to 5.4. So in 2012, Portland was actually a really affordable city to buy real estate in relative to earnings. So locals back then in 2012, 2013 would have had a much better chance of buying a house, at a reasonable price. But then, of course, since then, values and prices have shot way back up in Portland, all the way to the 8.6 level again. So 8.6, this is the same level that Portland was at right before the last housing crash. Typical price of around 480,000 compared to annual earnings of 55,000 for the typical worker. So again, Portland is really in this red zone of stressing the wages of the local worker, and that's a destabilizing force for the local economy. And so when home prices start to exceed wages by this amount, what does that mean fundamentally? Well, it means people who have lived in Portland for a long time, who grew up in Portland, they often can't afford to buy real estate in Portland anymore, right? And what that then causes is outward migration from the city, right? A lot of the locals who have lived there for a long time, they start needing to leave because they simply can't afford it. Now, to the benefit of real estate market in Portland, a lot of new people come in. Maybe some people from California, maybe some people from Seattle will move to Portland who earn some more money and will support the higher prices. That's what's been going on in Portland over the last 10 years or so, a lot of positive inward migration from wealthier areas. However, there's a limit to how much of that can happen, and Portland is starting to run into that limit. It was seeing huge increases in migration and population growth in the early to mid 2000s, like 2014, 2015. Those increases in population have started to decline significantly over the last 3 to 4 years. And I suspect that's due to the prices in Portland basically causing some people to say, I am out of here. I'm moving out. I can't afford it anymore. And you can see that represented on this graph, and it looks a little complicated, so let me explain it. Let's just take a second to walk through it. So don't turn away just yet. I'll explain what this means. So on this graph, we're comparing population growth in the Portland metro to the permitting of new housing supply. And the population growth is the blue line, the new housing supply permitting is the orange line. And what you want as a real estate market is you want population growth, at least from the perspective of a homeowner or a real estate investor, is you want population growth to be way above permitting. So you want to see like what you saw in 2016 when population growth was 46,000 and permitting was only 14,000. It was a 3-to-1 differential. So that's what these green bars are, the ratio between the two. So in 2016, population growth was 3.1 times the amount of new permitting. And that's kind of a situation where there's a housing shortage, right? There's more and more new people moving in, not enough new housing being built. But what you can see is that over the last 4 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, this ratio between population growth to permitting has really declined substantially. 1.8 in 2017, 1.3 in 2018, 1-to-1. It was 1-to-1 in 2019, 1.3 to 1 in 2020. And you can see that actually visually by these blue and orange lines kind of getting close together. The amount of population being added, the amount of permitting is getting close together. We can see that the last time this happened, the last time in Portland it dipped below 2-to-1 in consecutive years was 2003, 2004, 2005. Right prior to the last housing crash was the last time we saw this population to permit ratio in Portland go below 2-to-1 for an extended period of time. And again, what does that mean if we go below 2-to-1? That means more and more new housing is being built relative to how many people are moving to the area and are living in the area. And that's a destabilizing and bad sign for the real estate market. So Portland kind of has this double whammy for the housing market right now, where prices are going up really high relative to local wages at the same time that population growth is decreasing and permitting of new housing supply is increasing. So I think that sets Portland up for some issues in the housing market over the next year to 2 years. You're not seeing those issues now, right? Like, so right now in present day, inventory is really low. If you're trying to buy a house in Portland, it's pretty difficult, right? So I think a lot of you might be saying, well, this doesn't make sense. Right now, it's very difficult to buy a house in Portland. And that's true. But what's important to understand is it's hard to buy a house everywhere right now, right? If you go from Portland to Austin to even Boston, or even you go to Sweden, right, or the United Kingdom, it's hard to buy a house right now. Inventory is low. Well, you really should be asking yourself, if you're a home buyer and an investor that cares about appreciation and the financial side to your investment, you should be asking yourself what the situation is going to look like in 1 to 2 years, not what it's going to look like right now. And a great indication of what that situation is going to look like in 1 to 2 years is that relationship between permitting and population, because it takes about 1 to 2 years for a permit to turn into a completed unit. Right? So I think we're going to see in 2022, we're going to start to see some softening in Portland's real estate market, because we're going to start to see some new building relative to fewer and fewer people moving to the city. Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, there's significant variations within Portland, within the metro area that we looked at. Some areas are doing really, really well from a real estate perspective right now. Other areas are doing really, really poorly. And this situation, this kind of inequality in real estate appreciation is more significant in Portland than it is in other cities. Like, I look at a lot of different markets throughout the country. I do these deep dives each Wednesday, and I haven't quite seen the level of differential that we're seeing in Portland between the outlying suburbs, which have been getting a lot of migration and price appreciation over the last year, and then the interior downtown area, which has seen a lot of outward migration and has actually seen price declines in terms of real estate. Portland has a really, let's just say, unequal real estate market dynamic going on right now. And you guys can see what I'm talking about on this map, where we're looking at the price appreciation in zip codes across the Portland metro over the last year. So the more purple or magenta the zip code looks, the higher the price appreciation. The more translucent or gray it looks, the lower the price appreciation. And so the first thing that pops off the page right here is the dramatic differences in price appreciation in Portland over the last year. So if we go up north to Columbia County, we're seeing plus 19, plus 20% price appreciation. If we're going to Clark County, Washington, we're seeing plus 15% price appreciation. If we're going to the southwest, Yamhill County, we're seeing 15% price appreciation, right? Lots and lots of pink and magenta on the outer ring of the metro. But the more we zoom in, right, the more gray that we see, right? And especially in this very urban downtown area of Portland, right? We see a 97209, which is an area called the Pearl District. Prices have only appreciated by 3% in the last year. And that's pretty bad, because when prices are appreciating by 13% nationally and 20% in other parts of your metro, if you're only at plus 3%, that's pretty poor relative appreciation. It gets even worse when you go to 97204. And this is actually the principal like downtown zip code here in Portland is 97204. You can actually see prices here have declined by 3% in the last year. So we actually see a price decline, which you do not see many of those in zip codes across the country right now, price declines, but you're seeing it in 97204. And this is actually the area where most of the social unrest, rioting, and looting, and buildings being burned, most of that's occurring in this zip code in Portland. And so this is actually a very kind of real-time, tangible sign of the decline that we're starting to see in the urban area of Portland. It's the real estate prices in 97204. And a principal reason for this is that social unrest I mentioned. Like if you Google Portland, social unrest or rioting, you're gonna see tons and tons of news articles. And here we are a year later, right? After most of this started across America, and Portland still has issues with it. And actually it's spilling over not just into specific protests and rioting and looting, but to just crime across the city. Crime in general in Portland is increasing, and this is a problem for the city, not just the downtown area, but this is a problem for the city in general. Because if you have a declining urban core of your city, that's not good news for the metro in general. That's going to mean that your city is in negative news headlines constantly. It's going to mean that businesses aren't going to want to relocate there. It's going to mean that people who are thinking of moving to the area aren't going to want to move there anymore, even if it is confined to a specific region, right? Like you just got to imagine someone in New York who's trying to decide, do I want to live in Seattle or Portland or LA or Salt Lake? They're seeing headlines about Portland and all the stuff that's going on, so they're going to say to themselves, maybe I'll pick one of these other cities. And I think one of the principal reasons why Portland is really struggling right now from a political and social standpoint is the politics, especially of Multnomah County, which is one of the most liberal counties in America. And when I say liberal, I don't mean just a little liberal. I mean that 80% of the people in this county, with over 800,000 people, voted for Biden in the 2020 election. Only about 18% voted for Trump. So when you have 4 out of 5 in a large county all thinking a certain way politically, that tends to be destructive to the social order, right? It's much better for an area to have more diverse political opinions. You want people who think one way and people who think another way, right? What you're seeing in Portland is a monoculture that's developing politically, especially from the state level, where the state is liberal. Governor Kate Brown has enacted a lot of kind of negative policies for real estate and the economy, whether they be rent control or continued lockdowns and shutdowns of counties across Portland due to COVID. And then you have it on the local level, so it's like a double whammy. And then the county, the mayor, and the city council in Portland is also extremely liberal. And I just want to be clear here. There's nothing wrong with liberalism or Democrats by any means, but there's a problem when a certain area starts thinking too much in one direction politically, and there's no check on that political ideology taking over. And that's one of the reasons why you're just seeing such unrestrained protesting, unrestrained rioting, and a lack of law and order in Portland, which is negatively affecting its economy and real estate market. And so what we're looking at on this graph are the presidential voting margins in the 4 largest counties in Portland across the last 6 presidential elections. And so let's just start with Multnomah. So you can see in 2020, 80% of the population voted for Biden, 18% for Trump. That was a plus 62% margin for the Democratic candidate. And you can see Multnomah has just gotten increasingly liberal over the last 20 years, right? Washington County has also gotten increasingly liberal. This was a county that in 2000 was pretty even, and now it's plus 35% Democrat. But even plus 35%, that's still nowhere close to the level of one-sided political thinking that's going on in Multnomah County. Clackamas and Clark County, on the other hand, are much more moderate. Where you're slightly left-leaning, but not by too much. Clark County plus 5%, Clackamas County plus 11%. So there's much more of a balanced political structure in Clark and Clackamas, whereas Washington, especially Multnomah, are just becoming increasingly one-sided in how their governments are run. And so in Portland, more generally, we have this cocktail of a bunch of negative things. The first is that prices, real estate prices across the metro, are just much higher than wages. Especially the growth in prices is much higher than the growth in wages. And that's stressing local households and their ability to afford a home. And that's destabilizing for the housing market. The same exact thing happened in 2007 before the crash that sent values declining by 30% in Portland. At the same time, we're seeing a decline in overall population growth, especially within the urban center of Portland. We're seeing an increase in permitting of new homes. And so Portland's ratio of population growth to permitting today is actually at lower levels than it was prior to the last housing crash, and that is also concerning. The third issue that I'm seeing in Portland right now is just an increasingly progressive liberal political ideology with no room for other types of thinking. 4 out of 5 people in Multnomah County all vote Democrat, right? That just level of political monoculture is not a good thing. And so I think why you're seeing so much social unrest and so many issues in terms of violence that are going on in Portland right now. And so for all of that, I'm negative, I'm bearish on Portland in general. Right? It would not be the first market I select to invest in from a real estate perspective right now. However, you are someone who lives in Portland, right? And you're looking for maybe a safe place to invest, or you are an investor who's in Portland. Maybe you do want to consider Clark County, right? It's a more moderate political area. It's still seeing good migration and population growth. And maybe so you want to look in Clark County. Additionally, if you live in Clark County, you don't pay state income tax in Washington because you're a Washington resident, and you can drive into Portland to buy your goods and you wouldn't pay any sales tax. Because basically Washington state has no income tax, Portland has no sales tax. So if you live in Clark County close to the border, you get that nice little dual benefit and lower taxation. So that would be the type of area I would look. And more specifically, at a local neighborhood level, I'd want to target an area with solid population growth numbers, a high level of college degrees, low level of poverty, and increasing incomes. If you target an area that meets those demographic standards, you're protecting yourself more against a real estate decline. If you guys want help with doing that, that's what I do here at ReVenture Consulting. I help home buyers and investors find the areas that best fit their investment goals. And we do that through one-on-one coaching. So in our one-on-one coaching, it would be very much like you saw this video, except it would be one-on-one and dynamic, and we'd walk through all the data in Portland at a micro level. So reach out to me if you want, if you're interested in something like that. Go to www.reventureconsulting.com, www.reventureconsulting.com, and submit a contact form. And let me know what you're doing in real estate and what you're thinking of doing, whether you're buying a house or an investment property. And I could do this for any city in America. So if you don't live in Portland but you're somewhere else, also submit that contact form. All right, guys, that's it for today. This is Nick signing off. Our next video is coming out on Sunday. That's going to be an exploration into the best and worst markets in America for Airbnb rentals and investments. I know a lot of you guys out there are interested in vacation rentals, Airbnb rentals, so you'll want to watch that video. We're going to look at the best and worst markets in America for Airbnb investments. So you're going to want to check that out on Sunday. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss it. All right, I'll talk to you guys then.